They said no one in the room would understand it. And for a moment, I believed them until I heard a single sentence that changed the entire silence inside the Moretti estate. The morning I arrived at the mansion on the edge of Lake Geneva, it felt less like stepping into a home and more like entering a place built to hold secrets too heavy for ordinary language. I, Emily Carter, was not supposed to be there in any meaningful way. Just another waitress hired through an agency to serve water, coffee, and silence to men who spoke in numbers instead of feelings. Yet that morning, I found myself walking across polished stone floors that reflected chandeliers like frozen constellations. In the center of the grand hall stood a long black table surrounded by men and women who carried the kind of confidence that does not need introduction, and above them all, at the head of the table, was Alexander Moretti. He did not speak at first. He simply watched as 25 interpreters from around the world attempted to decode what lay before them. A single fragment of language carved into an ancient metal tablet, its symbols worn but deliberate, described only as an oath passed through generations of the Moretti lineage. One by one, the experts tried and failed, their voices shifting between Latin reconstruction, medieval dialect theory, and modern cryptographic models, but nothing fit, nothing aligned, and each failure made the room heavier. I kept my eyes lowered as I poured water into crystal glasses, telling myself I was invisible, that people like me were meant to move quietly through spaces like this and leave no trace behind. But then I heard it, not the full sentence, just a fragment of sound as one of the interpreters misread a symbol aloud, and something inside me tightened like recognition I could not explain. I paused for half a second too long, just enough for the world to notice. And when I looked up, Alexander Moretti was already watching me with an expression that did not belong to curiosity alone but to calculation, as if I had interrupted a pattern only he could see forming. The lead linguist dismissed me with a glance, assuming I was nothing more than staff. But Alexander raised a hand, stopping the room without speaking, and for the first time since I had entered, I felt the weight of every I turn in my direction. I should have stepped back, should have returned to the routine of serving and disappearing, but the fragment kept echoing in my mind, repeating itself like a locked door waiting for the right pressure. I heard myself speak before I understood why, my voice quieter than the glass I had been holding, and I said that the structure of the oath was not purely linguistic, that it carried rhythm patterns similar to coded maritime signals used in older coastal trade routes. And the room froze not because I was right, but because I was not supposed to know that. 25 experts had failed, yet in that moment, the entire system of authority in the room shifted toward a waitress who was only supposed to pour water and remain unseen. And Alexander Moretti leaned forward slightly, as if hearing something he had been waiting for far longer than I could imagine, something that recognized me before I recognized it myself. The moment I finished speaking, I immediately regretted it, not because I was wrong, but because in a room like that, people were not used to voices that did not belong to them being correct. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced before, as if the entire estate had paused to decide whether I was an anomaly or a mistake. I lowered my gaze again, my hands returning to the tray, telling myself I had crossed a line that would not be forgiven. But then I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving away from the head of the table. Alexander Moretti did not raise his voice. He did not need to, because when he spoke the room already belonged to him, and what he said next was not directed at the experts but at me. He asked my name, and for a moment I hesitated, because names in places like this did not feel like something you gave freely. They felt like something that could be used later. I answered anyway, Emily Carter, and I watched as several of the interpreters exchanged looks that suggested confusion, not at my answer, but at the fact that I was still standing there. Alexander repeated my name once, as if testing its weight, then turned slightly toward the tablet at the center of the table and asked a question no one else had considered, not what the inscription meant in translation, but what it was meant to preserve. The lead linguist attempted to respond, but Alexander raised his hand again, and the interruption was final without needing force. I could feel the attention of the room shift in a way that made the air feel thinner, and I told myself again that I should leave, that nothing good came from becoming part of conversations like this. Yet my feet did not move. Instead, I noticed something I should not have, a subtle pattern in the arrangement of symbols that matched fragments I had seen years ago in a borrowed maritime history book during a night shift break. A detail so small, I almost dismissed it as coincidence until it aligned too perfectly with the rhythm I had spoken earlier. I whispered without meaning to that the oath was not simply language or code, but something structured like a navigational memory system, designed to be understood only when spoken in relation to specific environmental context. And the room reacted not with disbelief this time, but with silence that felt like recognition. One of the interpreters attempted to challenge me, but stopped halfway through the sentence when Alexander stepped closer to the table. His eyes fixed on me now with an intensity that erased everything else in the room. He asked me where I had learned something like that, and I told him the truth, that I had not learned it anywhere important, only from fragments of study I picked up over time while working and studying at night, never imagining it would matter. For the first time, his expression shifted slightly, not into softness, but into something sharper, like a decision forming behind his eyes. He instructed everyone except me to leave the hall, and the order was obeyed immediately without argument, leaving me standing alone in a space that suddenly felt too large to contain both of us. When the doors closed, the echo that followed made it feel like the world outside had been sealed away, and Alexander looked at the ancient inscription again before saying quietly that people had spent decades trying to translate it, but none of them had been asked the right question. Then he looked back at me and said that I had not translated it either. I had understood it, and in that moment I realized that whatever this was, it had already moved beyond interpretation and into something far more dangerous, something that felt like recognition rather than discovery. For the first time in that room, I felt something shift that had nothing to do with language and everything to do with attention, the kind of attention that does not leave once it finds a reason to stay. Alexander Moretti did not look at me the way people usually look at staff or strangers. He looked at me like I was a missing variable in a system he had been trying to solve for a very long time. I should have stepped back, should have returned to the safety of silence, but instead I found myself still standing near the table where the ancient inscription lay between us like a closed door waiting for the correct key. He asked me again, more quietly this time, not what I thought it meant, but how I had recognized its structure without formal training, and I told him I did not recognize it as structure at all, only as something that felt familiar in a way I could not explain, like a memory I had never consciously formed. The lead interpreter tried once more to interject, insisting that what I was suggesting had no academic foundation, but Alexander did not even turn his head, and that single dismissal was enough to end the discussion entirely. Instead, he instructed the remaining staff to step back from the table, leaving only him, me, and the artifact that had already caused hours of failed analysis. When the room cleared, the silence changed. It became personal, almost intimate in a way that made me suddenly aware of my own breathing. Alexander walked slowly around the table, studying the inscription again, and I noticed for the first time that the symbols were not evenly distributed. They followed intentional gaps, like pauses in speech rather than written language, and without thinking I said that it was not meant to be read continuously. It was meant to be spoken in intervals aligned with external timing references, possibly tidal cycles or navigation markers. He stopped immediately, and for a second I thought I had made a mistake, but instead I saw something in his expression that resembled confirmation rather than doubt. He asked me where I had learned to think in that way, and I told him the truth again, that I worked nights, studied whatever I could afford, and had once read fragments of maritime communication systems while trying to pass time between shifts, never imagining it would connect to anything beyond theory. Alexander listened without interruption, and when I finished speaking, he said something that changed the atmosphere completely, not as an accusation, but as a realization, that the oath was not failing to be translated. It was refusing to be translated by anyone who did not understand context. I asked what he meant, and for the first time his gaze softened just enough to feel more dangerous than before, because certainty often hides itself behind calmness. He explained that the Moretti archive had documented this inscription for generations, always treated as symbolic or ceremonial, but never as functional communication, and yet I had described it in a way that implied usage, not meaning. That distinction made my chest tighten, because it suggested I was not interpreting something ancient. I was recognizing something operational, I looked back at the inscription again, and for reasons I could not control, I felt a strange sense of alignment, as if the patterns were not being decoded but remembered. Alexander noticed my reaction immediately and stepped closer, not invading distance but reducing it in a way that made the space between understanding and certainty feel dangerously small. He said quietly that if I was correct, then what lay before us was not just an oath, but a system designed to be activated, and that every expert in the room had been looking at it as text instead of function. I felt my throat tighten at the implication, because it meant the failure was not theirs alone. It was structural, built into the way people were taught to see language. And then, without warning, he asked me to stay, not as a guest, not as staff, but as someone he wanted closer to the problem. And in that moment, I understood that whatever I had stepped into was no longer about translation. It was about being part of something that had already been waiting for me long before I ever arrived. The moment he asked me to stay, it did not feel like an invitation in any ordinary sense. It felt like a decision that had already been made somewhere long before I was given the chance to respond. I remember standing there with my hands still slightly damp from carrying trays, my mind trying to catch up to the idea that a waitress from an agency assignment in Geneva had just been positioned at the center of something that 25 trained experts could not solve. Alexander Moretti did not repeat his request. He simply waited, as if silence itself was part of his authority. And for reasons I still do not fully understand, I did not walk away. Instead, I nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and that small gesture changed the entire structure of the room. He instructed the remaining staff to clear the hall completely, and within moments the grand space emptied until only the two of us remained with the ancient inscription resting on its pedestal under soft golden light. The absence of others made everything sharper. Every sound became intentional. Every breath felt measured. Alexander moved closer to the artifact again, but this time he did not look at it as an object of study. He looked at it as if it were responding to presence rather than observation. He asked me to repeat what I had perceived earlier, not as interpretation, but as experience. And I found myself explaining something I did not fully understand myself, that the pattern of the symbols felt incomplete unless I imagined pauses between them, almost like the structure of instructions meant to be carried out in sequence rather than read as text. As I spoke, I noticed his expression shift subtly, not with surprise, but with confirmation, like a theory he had never spoken aloud was finally being echoed back to him. He told me that every official translation attempted over the years had treated the inscription as symbolic language, something meant to be preserved, not executed. But what I was describing suggested function, timing, and response. I asked him what kind of response, and for the first time his voice lowered slightly, not in secrecy, but in precision, as if the words themselves required care. And he said that the Moretti lineage had always recorded references to an oath that was not merely spoken, but enacted under specific conditions, conditions no one had been able to identify. I felt a quiet tension rise in my chest as I realized the implication, because if what he was saying was true, then the failure of interpretation was not a matter of intelligence but perspective, and every expert who had stood in this room had been looking at a system designed to be misunderstood when viewed incorrectly. Alexander turned back to me and asked a question that felt heavier than the room itself, asking if I had ever experienced this kind of recognition before, not of language, but of structure, as if something internal responded before understanding arrived. I hesitated because the answer felt both simple and impossible, and I told him that I had often noticed patterns in things others dismissed, not in an academic sense, but in the way systems behaved when observed long enough, especially during quiet hours when I worked and thought at the same time. He studied me carefully after that, and I could see that he was no longer treating me as an anomaly, but as a variable that belonged inside his calculations. Then he did something that changed the tone entirely. He asked me to sit at the table where the interpreters had failed, not as staff, not as observer, but as someone whose perspective might be necessary to continue. And as I moved toward the seat, I realized that whatever this oath represented, it was no longer locked in the past. It was actively unfolding in the present, and somehow I had already been included in it before I ever understood why. When I sat down at the long black table, It felt less like taking a seat and more like crossing an invisible boundary that I could not see but immediately feel, as if the moment my body aligned with. The chair. I had agreed to participate in something far larger than a conversation. Across from me, Alexander Moretti did not speak right away, and that silence was not empty. It was structured, almost deliberate, like he was waiting for the room to decide what I was. The ancient inscription remained between us under the warm light, but now it no longer felt like a distant artifact. It felt closer, as if proximity alone had changed its meaning. Alexander finally slid a thin document beside it, a collection of fragmented symbols that had also been submitted by the interpreters earlier, and he asked me not to translate it, but to describe what I saw without forcing it into language. I studied the fragments carefully, and something unusual happened, not like remembering a fact, but like recognizing a pattern the way you recognize a melody after hearing only a few notes. I told him that the structure was inconsistent only when read linearly, but when viewed as alternating intervals, it formed repeating clusters that resembled coordinated instruction cycles, something closer to procedural signaling than written communication. One of the interpreters sitting further back in the room immediately objected, saying that such an interpretation had no academic precedent. But Alexander raised his eyes slightly, and the objection stopped mid-sentence without further pressure. I felt the weight of attention shift again, not just toward me, but around me, as if the room itself was adjusting its expectations. Alexander asked me how I was able to perceive structure without formal methodology, and I admitted that I was not perceiving it through training, but through familiarity with patterns that repeat in systems people often overlook, especially in environments where time is fragmented and information arrives in pieces. As I spoke, I noticed his gaze sharpen slightly, not in skepticism but in evaluation, as though he was mapping what I said against something already stored in his understanding. Then he placed another fragment on the table, smaller this time, and said it had never been shown to any of the interpreters because it was considered incomplete, but I immediately saw that it was not incomplete at all. It was simply separated from its corresponding interval. I aligned it mentally with the first set, and the pattern became clearer, forming a layered sequence that suggested conditional activation rather than static meaning. And when I explained this, the room went completely still. Alexander leaned back slightly, and for the first time, there was a subtle shift in his expression that suggested not authority but confirmation, as if something he had suspected for years had finally taken form in front of him. He asked me to continue, and I realized that this was no longer about whether I was correct, but about how far the recognition extended. I told him that if the structure depended on timing and separation, then the oath was not meant to be understood all at once, but reconstructed through contextual exposure, meaning that every failed interpreter had been working against the design itself. The implications of that statement lingered in the air, because it suggested intentional concealment at a level far beyond language. Alexander stood slowly, moving around the table until he was closer to me, not threatening, but close enough that the space between observation and involvement disappeared. He said quietly that if what I was describing was accurate, then I was not simply interpreting the oath. I was interacting with it in the way it was originally intended. And in that moment, I understood that the real question was no longer what the inscription meant, but why I was able to understand it at all, and why Alexander Moretti seemed less surprised by that fact than he should have been. For a long moment after he spoke, I could not tell whether the room was holding its breath or whether I was the only one still aware of my own, because everything around me felt suspended at the edge of something that had not yet decided its shape. Alexander Moretti did not move away from me, and that alone changed the temperature of the space more than any words had. He looked at the fragments on the table again, then back at me, and said something I did not expect, that interpretation was no longer the purpose, because what was unfolding was recognition, and recognition did not require permission. I felt a slight tightening in my chest at the word, because it implied connection rather than analysis, and I was not prepared for that distinction. He asked me to walk with him, not as an order, but as if it were the natural next step in a process already in motion, and before I could fully consider the consequences, I stood and followed him through a side corridor beyond the main hall. The corridor was quieter, lined with dark stone and soft light that did not reveal its source, and the further we walked, the more the mansion felt less like a residence and more like a structure built around secrecy itself. He stopped at a smaller chamber where additional documents were arranged on a table, older papers, handwritten notes, and partial transcriptions of the same inscription I had just examined. He told me that every attempt to decode the oath over the past decades had ended in contradiction, not because the information was wrong, but because it was incomplete by design, separated intentionally into fragments that only revealed meaning under specific alignment. I studied the papers carefully, and again the same sensation returned, not learning but familiarity, as if my mind was filling gaps without instruction. I pointed out that the intervals between symbols were consistent across all versions, even when the transcription styles differed, and that consistency suggested an underlying timing structure rather than linguistic origin. Alexander did not interrupt, and that silence felt more significant than agreement. He asked if I understood what it meant if I was correct, and I admitted I was not fully sure, only that it implied the oath was not a message but a system that responded to conditions rather than interpretation. He nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something he had already accepted privately. Then he said something that changed the direction of everything, that the Moretti family had preserved references to individuals throughout history who could perceive these structures without formal instruction, people who did not learn the system but recognized it instinctively when exposed to it. I turned to him immediately at that, because the idea did not feel theoretical. It felt uncomfortably relevant, and I asked if he believed I was one of those people. He did not answer directly. Instead, he placed another document in front of me, one that contained not text, but a diagram of repeated patterns that matched exactly what I had described earlier without ever seeing it in full context. I felt my hands go still as I looked at it, because the alignment was undeniable, and Alexander observed my reaction without speaking, as if he was confirming not just my ability, but my place within something far older than this room. After a moment, he said quietly that if I could consistently see what others could not, then my presence here was not coincidence, it was convergence, and the words settled between us like something irreversible, because it suggested that whatever I thought had brought me into this mansion was only the surface of a much deeper structure that had already begun long before I ever arrived. The word he used, convergence, stayed in my mind longer than anything else he had said, not because it sounded important, but because it sounded final, as if whatever path had brought me into this mansion was not something that could be retraced or undone. I stood in the quiet study with Alexander Moretti still watching me, as if he was measuring something that did not exist on paper. And for the first time I became aware that my presence here had shifted from accidental to necessary in his understanding. He closed the folder in front of me slowly, not as an end to the discussion but as a transition, and said that if what he suspected was correct, then the oath was not simply an artifact of history. It was part of a living framework that only activated under specific human recognition patterns. I asked him what kind of patterns he meant, and he answered without hesitation that certain individuals did not interpret systems in the traditional sense. They resonated with them, as if their perception aligned naturally with structure rather than language. The idea should have felt abstract, but instead it felt uncomfortably familiar, like something I had always done. Without naming it, he turned and walked toward a narrow hallway leading deeper into the estate, and after a brief pause, I followed again, because at that point leaving felt less like an option and more like a contradiction. We entered a smaller chamber with no windows, only a circular table surrounded by low light and sealed display cases containing fragments of the same inscription arranged in different configurations. Alexander placed the remaining documents at the center of the table and asked me to look at them without trying to translate, only to describe what changed when I viewed them together. As I focused, I noticed something subtle that had not been obvious before. The symbols were not just repeated, they were responding to proximity, forming different groupings depending on arrangement, like they were designed to be assembled rather than read. I told him that the structure behaved like a modular system, where meaning emerged only when components were positioned correctly, and as soon as I said it, I saw a flicker in his expression that suggested confirmation. He told me that for decades, every expert had treated each fragment as isolated language, but no one had considered that separation itself was part of the design. I felt a quiet pressure building in my thoughts as I realized the implication, because it meant the system was interactive, not passive, and required the right observer to complete it. Alexander then did something unexpected. He placed a final fragment at the center of the table and stepped back, as if inviting me to engage with it directly. And when I leaned closer, I felt a strange sense of alignment, not emotional but structural, as if my perception adjusted itself without effort. I pointed out that when the fragments were aligned in a specific order, they formed a repeating sequence that suggested conditional response rather than static meaning. And Alexander exhaled slowly, a sign I had not yet seen from him, something closer to certainty than control. He said quietly that if this was true, then the oath was not just a record of the past. It was a mechanism that responded to recognition itself, and that meant it had been waiting for someone capable of completing it. I asked him why he thought that person would be me, and for the first time he did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied me with a kind of calm intensity that felt less like evaluation and more like confirmation already reached. Finally, he said that he did not think I had arrived here by chance, and that the system had already responded the moment I first recognized its structure in the main hall, because recognition, once triggered, was irreversible. The room felt quieter after that statement, not because anything had changed physically, but because everything now felt aligned towards something I could no longer identify as external. And as I stood there surrounded by fragments of a language that refused to remain still, I understood that whatever this oath truly was, it was no longer something I was observing. It was something that had begun to observe me in return. The silence that followed felt different from everything before it, not empty and not heavy, but structured, as if the room itself had adjusted to a new configuration that neither of us had consciously chosen. I stood at the circular table with the fragments arranged in patterns I no longer needed to look at twice to understand, and I realized that Alexander Moretti was no longer observing me as an outsider, but as a necessary component of the system we were both standing inside. He did not speak immediately, and instead he watched my reaction to the alignment of the final fragment, as if waiting for confirmation from me rather than from the documents themselves. I noticed my breathing had slowed without intention, as if my attention had synchronized with something external, and that sensation made me more aware than ever that what was happening could not be explained through ordinary interpretation. Alexander finally said that every record in his family archive described the same phenomenon, that the oath did not reveal itself to scholars or specialists, but to individuals who could perceive structural alignment without instruction, and I asked him what that meant for me specifically, because I could feel the answer forming even before he spoke it. He moved slightly closer to the table and said that if I was truly recognizing patterns that others could not, then the system was no longer being studied. It was being activated in real time through recognition itself, and that meant my presence was not observational but functional. I looked down at the fragments again and saw something I had not noticed before, not a change in the symbols, but a change in how they seemed to respond to my attention, as if focus alone altered their relational structure. I told him that the configuration was stabilizing only when viewed from a specific perspective, and that each adjustment I made seemed to complete another layer of the sequence, and he did not question that statement. He simply accepted it, as though it confirmed a conclusion already reached. For the first time, he stepped back from the table entirely, giving me full visual access to the arrangement, and said that the Moretti lineage had spent generations trying to preserve something they never fully understood, a system that required recognition rather than translation, and I felt a subtle shift in understanding as I realized that preservation without comprehension had always been the point. I asked him why this system would depend on recognition at all, and he answered that certain structures were designed to remain dormant until encountered by the right cognitive alignment, not because they were hidden, but because they were selective. That word lingered in my mind longer than the rest, because it suggested intention embedded not in language, but in design itself. I returned my attention to the table and noticed that the fragments now formed a complete cycle only when I considered them in a sequence that matched the rhythm I had instinctively described earlier, and that realization made everything else feel less like discovery and more like confirmation of something already underway. Alexander observed my reaction closely and said quietly that the oath had never failed to be decoded. It had simply never met the conditions required to reveal itself fully. and I felt a quiet tension rise at the implication because it meant the system had been waiting, not for expertise, but for recognition that could not be taught. As I stood there, I understood that whatever brought me into this mansion had already crossed a threshold long before I was aware of it, and that from this point forward, there was no meaningful distinction between observing the system and being part of its function. It felt like the room had stopped being a place and had become a system that only responded when certain conditions were met. And as I stood there with Alexander Moretti beside me, I understood that we were no longer looking at fragments of an ancient oath. We were standing inside its activation process without fully realizing where the boundary between observation and participation had disappeared. He did not speak for a long time, and that silence no longer felt like evaluation. It felt like alignment, as if my presence had shifted something fundamental in how the system behaved. I looked at the final configuration on the table again, and this time it no longer felt like separate pieces arranged for study. It felt like a complete structure waiting for execution under the right cognitive conditions. Alexander finally broke the silence and said that what I had done was not interpretation in any academic sense, but synchronization, and I asked him what that meant for the system itself, because I could feel an answer forming in me that I had not consciously learned. He turned slightly toward me and said that every historical reference to the oath described the same limitation, that it remained inert until perceived by someone whose internal pattern recognition matched its structural logic. And I felt a quiet pressure in my chest because the implication was no longer abstract. It was personal. I asked him if that meant I was part of its design, and he did not deny it. Instead, he said that the system did not distinguish between observer and participant once recognition occurred. It simply adjusted. I looked down again and noticed something new, not in the fragments themselves, but in how my attention moved across them, as if the sequence was guiding my perception rather than the other way around. Alexander stepped closer to the table and said quietly that the Moretti archive contained records of previous occurrences where individuals like me had appeared, people who could complete structural recognition without formal training, and I felt a subtle shift in understanding because it suggested that what was happening was not unique, but cyclical. I asked him why none of those individuals had been documented publicly, and he answered that recognition events were always contained within closed systems, because once activated, the structure created dependencies that extended beyond language or history. I felt a pause settle between us as that idea expanded, because it meant nothing in this room was isolated anymore. Not the oath, not the fragments, and not me. I returned my attention to the completed configuration, and for the first time I saw it not as an artifact, but as a functioning sequence, something that required continuity rather than analysis. And I realized that the system was no longer waiting to be understood, it was already operating through the act of being perceived. Alexander spoke again, more softly now, saying that if I continued to align with it, there would be no return to the position I held before entering this estate, because recognition once stabilized becomes a condition that cannot be reversed. I did not respond immediately, not because I lacked an answer, but because I understood that any response I gave would already be part of the system he was describing. And in that moment, I accepted the final realization that whatever brought me here had never been about translation or discovery. It had been about whether I would complete what the structure had been designed to recognize all along.